I am thrilled to have Susan Sheever here. I never knew her before, but now I decide she's almost my best friend. We have had nothing but talking. When I was young, I only wanted to go to 2 colleges, and that was Sarah Lawrence and Bennington. And my mother and father thought they were way too liberal. Well, it turns out that she teaches at Bennington. And she's a graduate of Brown University, where everybody in my family has gone, all my children. And she teaches writing. I wish I could have had her as my teacher. Susan is a prolific writer. She's published 16 books. Many you have read her memoirs, a study about alcoholism, and she wrote a book about the man who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, who's made a great deal of sort of other people's lives, have helped them turn around. I've had many friends there. And she's going to write a book that she doesn't want to write, but she has to write, and it's about her father's short stories. And it says, and the name of it's going to be, when she writes it, When All Men Wore Hats. And this is exciting. So I want to introduce, I'm not going to say the subject she's going to talk about, because she hadn't figured it out last night. So now she's figured it out.
Thank you, Dale, for the spectacular introduction. Amazing woman you are. A future writer who will be standing up here as unable to write as I am, possibly. So thanks for coming, all of you, wherever you are. And again, thank you, Dale. Thanks for doing this and for everything you do. And I thought, so you can hear me, yes? And in Zoom land, higher? Right higher? Okay. Where's Angel? Oh, he's working on it.
He's turning.
Okay. So now I'm turning. Okay. All right, this is going to be a slight balancing act. Okay. Thank you, Dale. I didn't think I could talk to you today without, so you can hear me, right? But it's not missing? No. Okay. Without saying something about what we've all been through in the past year, which is still very much on my mind. And to me, one of the things I've learned in the past year is the importance of community, the importance of our friends who we sometimes can talk to and sometimes not, and especially the magic of conversation. And that's certainly, living in New York City, is what's gotten me through. First thing in the morning, I get up and go to the dog ride with my dog. And it's those conversations, those little incidental, meaningless, quote-unquote conversations that have certainly kept us all going in New York. And so I thought today I would try to have a conversation like that with you all. Some trick to have it with more than one person. And I also, the subject of what I'm going to talk about today is conversation, and the magical way in which people's incidental conversations with each other can lead to, in this case, great literature, in our case, perhaps just pleasure. So there are a couple of things. I've been thinking about this material a lot. I've written a couple of books about it, which we'll get to. But there were a couple of surprises that I wanted to start with, because I like surprises. One is that, as the great critic Ethel Matheson said, all of American literature, so that is Melville, Hawthorne, Thoreau, Emerson, Emily Dickinson, Longfellow, Whitman, all of American literature, what we call American literature, was written between 1850 and 1855. And most of it was written in Concord, Massachusetts. And that's what we call a genius cluster. So a lot of people throughout history have written about genius clusters. what makes them happen, what keeps them from happening. But today I'm going to talk about the genius cluster that was Concord, Massachusetts in the 1850s, 40s and 50s, because some of these guys warmed up to writing. And I also hope that we'll have a very lively Q&A, because I also think that Q&As are magic. And one of the great stories about that is that when Henry David Thoreau was living on Walden Pond, and we'll get to that, his friend Nathaniel Hawthorne, who he had met in Concord through Emerson, asked him to come and give a talk in Salem, where Hawthorne was living then, at the Salem Athenaeum. And Thoreau went to give his talk about a book he was writing about a trip on the Merrimack River that he had taken with his brother. And so he went and gave his talk, and then in the Q&A, all anybody in Salem wanted to know about was what it was like to live on Walden Pond. And so out of that Q&A came Thoreau's idea that he would take his journals from Walden Pond and make them into a book, right? So the Q&A is magic. The other surprise that I want to kind of launch at you is the way I got into this in the first place. It was about 20 years ago, somebody asked me to write an introduction to a new edition of Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. So I said, sure. And I had read it like you all did when I was young. And I reread Little Women, and the first surprise was how good it is. And then the second surprise was I picked up Martha Saxton's biography of Louisa May Alcott, and I found that Laurie, the boy next door in Little Women, the boyfriend, the dazzling boyfriend, was actually based on Henry David Thoreau. I didn't know that. I knew about the American Renaissance, that's Emerson, Hawthorne, Whitman, etc., and I knew about the Alcotts, but I didn't realize they lived across the street from each other. So this was all happening at the same time. So essentially what I did in this book is I took the writers of the American Renaissance, Hawthorne, Melville, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, etc., and included the women, who were Louisa May Alcott and Margaret Fuller, and the whole story, of course, changed. I had no idea that there were women involved in that, and that in the case of Louisa, they were living across the street. Thoreau was Louisa May Alcott's tutor. She had a terrible crush on him. She also had a terrific crush on Emerson, who lived across the street from the Alcotts, who had actually invited the Alcotts to Concord. And she loved Emerson's library, and he gave her the free use of it. And she wrote a novel called Moods, in which a woman very much like herself is forced to choose between a Thoreau-type man and an Emerson-type man. Of course, nobody reads Moods, nobody read Moods at the time, but we'll get to that. But those are a couple of surprises that took me aback. So I want to So I want to go backwards for a second now and ask you to imagine a spring evening in Concord, Massachusetts. A young couple. Sorry about this. In New York, we drink from glasses. A young couple, he's dazzlingly handsome, she's very pretty. They're living in a rented house that has been given to them for $100 a year because they have no money, and they're totally not successful in any way. And they're upstairs in the husband's study where he has written exactly nothing. And evening is falling, and the woman, again, they're renters, the woman takes off her engagement ring and she starts scratching in the window pane, right? And she writes, "Man's accidents are God's purposes." Scratching in someone else's window with her diamond, right? And they're laughing. And he writes, "Written with her diamond." What? Oh, who's having? All right, so she scratches,
What did he scratch?
she scratches, man's accidents are God's purposes. And he then scratches Nathaniel Hawthorne, because that's who it is. This is his study, and she then scratches written in the golden light. Now the sound has gone completely blurry. Shall I just forget the microphone? No. It's fine? Oh, okay. It's just.
Try to stay as close to the microphone as you
Oh,
can.
okay. Anyway, so that's something to think about. Man's accidents are God's purposes. And I like to imagine these two very naughty, beautiful young people in the house that Emerson has rented to them, scratching on the window with Sophia's diamond. It was a tremendous gift that Emerson rented them this house for $100 a year. They hadn't been able to get married because they had nowhere to live, and Emerson provided that. Alas, their tenancy in Emerson's house didn't end well. Another house guest that Emerson had was Margaret Fuller, an extremely sexy, smart woman who was the first woman to be allowed to read in the Harvard libraries. Of course, she couldn't go to Harvard because she was a woman. And Margaret Fuller would come and stay with the Emersons. Mrs. Emerson was upstairs, Margaret and Emerson were downstairs. And that suited everybody just fine until the Hawthornes moved in. And of course, Margaret Fuller and Hawthorne were old friends. And that started up again. And so one day, Emerson was taking a walk and he happened upon his friend Nathaniel Hawthorne with Margaret Fuller lying in the grass. We have no idea what they were doing. But whatever they were doing, the next day, Emerson told Hawthorne that he couldn't live in his house anymore and they had to leave Concord. And not only did he do that, he gave them 3 months and a construction crew descended on the house. So the 3 months they had left made where the house was uninhabitable. So that was, Emerson was sometimes a difficult landlord. But it was Emerson who founded this genius cluster, which is the Concord Writers. Emerson's story is also fascinating, so I'll just get to the genius cluster. He was an impoverished young man. He grew up, he joined the ministry. He married a very wealthy 18-year-old and was totally in love with her, and she with him, and she died. And she died when she was 19, still underage. And her family took the position that Emerson had just been a sort of visitor in their family. And he sued her family for her share of the fortune that she would have inherited, which people didn't do in the 1830s, by the way. And he got the money. And with that money, he moved to Concord, bought a big house. He married a very efficient woman. And he started inviting people to Concord, people who he thought were promising, and giving them either free houses or breaks on rent. Or so it was through the good offices of Emerson that the Hawthornes came to Concord and that the Alcotts came to Concord. And sort of the best and the most lasting story in a way is the story of how Henry David Thoreau and Emerson got together. Henry David Thoreau lived in Concord. His family ran the pencil factory in Concord, and Thoreau had gone to Harvard. He didn't think much of Harvard. And one day, Lucy Brown offered to take him over to the Emersons and introduce him to Emerson. So they walked over to the Emersons, and Thoreau and Emerson just hit it off. And Thoreau actually sort of fell in love with Emerson, started dressing like Emerson and talking like Emerson and having gestures like Emerson. People started making fun of Thoreau for his imitations of Emerson. Emerson said to Thoreau, now, if you want to be my protege, you've got to keep a journal. So Thoreau started keeping a journal. And their 30-year friendship was the sort of most important friendship in either of their lives. It went back and forth as friendships do. At one point, Emerson went to Europe for a year, and he left Thoreau in charge of his household, his wife and 2 children. And of course, they all liked Thoreau a whole lot better than they liked Emerson, because Thoreau was playful and, you know, up for anything. And Emerson was really the paterfamilias, right? So when Emerson came back from Europe in 1845, moved back into his own house and found that Thoreau had sort of taken over, he wasn't that happy, and he knew that Thoreau had to move out. So he says to his friend Thoreau, okay, you got to move out. And Thoreau says, I don't have anywhere to go. I can't move out. And Emerson says, well, I have a woodlot on Walden Pond. So why don't you go out there and build yourself something and live out there? And that's how Emerson went to Walden Pond. There was no like high-minded spiritual pursuit. There was no idea that he was going to be a hermit. It was his first apartment. He just had no, he had nowhere else to go. So he went out to Walden Pond, built himself a back little hut, and lived out there for a couple of years, essentially, because he had nowhere else to go. So Emerson and Thoreau. And I thought I would, water again. And with two things. But I wanted to read you. So these people, I can't read you their whole books. I can't stand up here and read Walden. But here's something that Thoreau said when he went to Walden. Here's something that he wrote in Walden. He said, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front the essential facts of life and learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. There's a sentence, right? And here's one of Emerson's, and this is Emerson on Genius Clusters. Meek young men grow up in libraries, believing it their duty to accept the views which Cicero, which Locke, which Bacon had given, forgetful that Cicero, Locke, and Bacon were only young men in libraries when they wrote these books. So, if you dip into Thoreau's work, Emerson's work, it's just Hawthorne's work, it's just astonishing work. And something about Concord, something about being poor and then being rich, something about Emerson's Big Daddy of American Literature act, which is what Hawthorne didn't like, inspired these guys. The Hawthornes actually came back 10 years later after Hawthorne had written The Scarlet Letter, and they bought the Alcott's house, and the Alcotts moved next door. It was all very incestuous, is the word we use for that these days. So I want to end with Louisa May Alcott, because she was the person who drew me into this group, and also so important and so fascinating. When I finished this book, I then wrote a biography of Louisa May Alcott because I couldn't get enough of her. She started writing to make money, and she wrote all kinds of potboilers, but what she wanted to write was a serious novel. And so over the years, she kind of saved up her time, and she wrote this serious novel called Moods, and nobody read it and nobody would buy it. And she had written a lot of smaller pieces for a guy called Thomas Nast, who was her editor. Actually, Larry and I were just having this conversation, only not about Louisa, about ourselves. So her editor, Thomas Nast, so in 1868, she gets to the point where Nast says to her, look, I can't sell any of your books, I can't sell any of your work, but he says, I can sell a book for young women. Write a book for young women. And Louisa May Alcott is really insulted. And she's like, I don't do YA. She didn't put it that way, right? But, I'm a serious novelist. I've spent 30 years working my way up the ladder, yada, yada, yada. And so Thomas Nast then writes to Bronson Alcott, Louisa's father, and says, I think Louisa should write a book for young women. And if she did, maybe I, Thomas Nast, would publish your work, Bronson, right? These people were not polite. So now Louisa has her father, with whom she's living, saying to her, come on, write a book about young women. What's the matter with that? Da, 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 da. And so she does. And I'd like to end with her. And I thought I would just, because I like hearing people read, I thought I would just read a couple of pages about that, but I'm gonna mess up this important, all right, so I'm gonna try to read from here. And then you'll ask me questions. And out of those questions will come my Walden. Louisa May Alcott was a reluctant, rebellious 36-year-old on the May morning in 1868 when she sat down to write Little Women. She worked at a small desk built in between two windows in her second floor bedroom at Orchard House. By the way, go to CONCORD. You can see where Sophia wrote that in the window. It's still there. This is all still there. A woolen shawl worn over her usual brown muslin warmed her against the drafts and the chill of New England. Mr. Niles wants a girl's story, and I begin Little Women, she wrote in her journal about her publisher's wish and the way in which it had become her command. Marmee, Anna, and May all approved my plan, so I plod away, although I don't enjoy this sort of thing. Never liked girls, or knew many except my sisters, but our queer experiences may prove interesting, although I doubt it. In spite of her doubts, Little Women, which was to become one of the best-selling books of all time and end the Alcott family's decades of debilitating poverty, seemed to take hold of Louisa as she wrote. True, The Writing of Moods, her serious novel, had also taken hold of her in a similar way. She quickly realized that she had already written some pieces about her family among the dozens of magazine pieces she had published, and she wrote fast, without revision. When she looked up during the day past the rustic board fence her father had built at the edge of the property, she saw people and carriages passing on the Lexington Road, and beyond the road, pastures sparkling with wildflowers. When she wrote at night by candlelight, she communed with a family of barred owls that lived in the broad branches of the huge elm tree outside her windows. As she wrote during the day, she could sometimes look down from the window and see her father, not working in the gardens behind the house, as he said he was, but sitting on the bench with a pile of his finest red pippin apples, waiting for the occasional traveler who might be ready for a dose of his own brand of high philosophical discourse. Sometimes Emerson dropped by. Sometimes Alcott would entertain a special visitor from Boston, like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, or Franklin Sanborn would wander up the Lexington Road to talk pedagogy, or one of the Hawthorne children would come over from next door. Beyond the meadows lay the shimmering water of Walden Pond and the fields and marshes where Louisa had taken so many passionate walks so long ago with her teacher and friend Thoreau. I'm going to throw in a couple more paragraphs. The little half-moon-shaped desk her father had built for her sat at the foot of Louisa's bed, surrounded by her books in a crowded cabinet bookcase, her sewing basket, family portraits, flower paintings by her older sister Anna. Although Orchard House was unheated, and the Alcotts in later years often closed it up for the winter, Louisa's room had a fireplace and windows facing south and west toward Concord. When she began writing Little Women, Louisa herself was still battling nervous exhaustion and arthritis brought on by the mercury poisoning, as well as pains in her legs and back. So among the other many, many interesting things about Louisa May Alcott is that she was a Civil War nurse. She went down to DC, worked in a hospital, wrote a book about it, Hospital Sketches, and was treated with mercury as people were treated in those days, and never really recovered from that medical treatment. That spring, there were many other reasons for her to be discouraged. Her first novel had failed as the culmination of decades of writing to order, editing others' work, teaching, and turning out the novelistic melodramas she called rubbish in order to alleviate the Alcott's habitual poverty. It had held all her hopes for a literary career, and those hopes were once again dashed. As she wrote at the window, the last lilacs faded and the rhododendron bloomed. By June, after a month of writing day and night, she sent in 12 chapters of the book to Thomas Niles of Roberts Brothers, who was also now her father's publisher. He thought it dull, she wrote in her journal. So do I. Nevertheless, she continued to work, and by July 15th had completed the 400-page manuscript that is the first part of Little Women. And, you know, Little Women, by September, she was rich and famous. It happened very fast with Little Women. So I don't know, of all the people that I wrote about in these books, Louisa ended up being my favorite for her feistiness, for her stick-to-itiveness, and for her dislike of having to write, which I certainly share with her. And also for her good luck, because she stumbled on something, she didn't want to do it. It was the last thing she wanted to do. She was insulted to be asked, and yet it changed her life and the life of everyone around her. So why don't I leave you with that and hope that you have questions. Thank you. Okay, it's your turn. Yes. Hi.
Hi, Susan. Thank you very much for that very stimulating and provocative talk. Question, Genius Cluster, Concord, Mass. Is there one in America today? If
Well-
so, where is it and where do they come from?
Well, genius clusters are a whole interesting, many people have studied genius clusters. I mean, Madison, Washington, Jefferson, that was a genius cluster. Plato, Socrates, that was a genius cluster. Certainly Bloomsbury was a genius cluster. And there are a lot of theories about what makes a genius cluster happen. Genius attracts genius, so that when you have a couple of geniuses, like you had Einstein at Princeton, then other people will come to be with that genius, and then you get a cluster like Einstein's cluster at Princeton. So, but are we not a genius cluster? I mean, that's the thing about genius clusters. You don't necessarily know when you're in a genius cluster, right? It's for posterity to judge whether or not us here in Palm Beach on March 18th, 2021 are a genius cluster. And that's one of the things that makes them fascinating as well. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, and I'm just waiting for the first female genius cluster.
Yay.
Yeah, maybe this is it. Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, I reread Little Women a couple of years ago. I don't even know why I did it, but what struck me is this isn't a young adult novel at all, and it gets that attitude toward it. It strikes me as just wrong.
I agree. Little Women is a great novel. I mean, she tries to kill her sister. It's not all prettied up at all. And then she's sorry that she tried to kill her sister. And then her mother gives her a little lecture about anger, in which her mother says, "I've been angry every day of my life. I live in a rage." So this is not your normal, it's certainly not, there's nothing pretty about it. And at the end, of course, Thomas Niles, who's the villain of today, I guess, said to her, you know, she has to get married. And Louisa was like, no way. And she's famous for saying, liberty is the best husband, right? Liberty is better than any husband I ever could have had. And she didn't get married, but they persuaded her to marry Joe off to Professor Bear, who's kind of a joke, right? He's a guy with a heavy German accent who pretends that there are mice in his pockets. I mean, yeah, this isn't what we want for our daughters. But I agree. It's a powerful novel about anger, about creativity, about not marrying the guy you're supposed to marry, about, I mean, it's really about death. I mean, it's a really powerful and astonishing novel. Although, alas, it does start on Christmas morning, when, alas, the Marches give their Christmas dinner to a poorer family. So I think some people, you know, when people say they read, often what they mean is they read the first scene. And I think maybe Little Women, if she had started with Joe trying to kill Amy on the ice, it might have a different reputation. But she didn't. She started it with Christmas. But I agree. It's a powerful, gritty novel. And you know, when you go to Concord, you'll see that it was written when they were living in the house next door, which Hawthorne then bought.
and the Concord, the guides who will take you through Orchard House have bought this anodyne version of the March family. And it wasn't even that house. So when I take that tour, I bite my tongue. Yes.
If anybody has a question for Susan, we'll just pass this microphone around so everybody can hear you.
One of my favorites is Thoreau, and I'm gonna repeat it from what I read here, so, and I wanna know how and why he wrote this. So, if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears the beat of a different drum. I think
Well,
it's
you know-
leadership, but I'm not quite sure.
Well, no, I think Thoreau, Emerson, I was just talking about Emerson's essays this morning. Emerson really invented this idea of the individual self. We all live on Emerson. We don't even know we're doing it, right? The whole idea that each of us has a destiny that we somehow have to, link ourselves with, and the idea that there is no God with a pattern or a plan that we're gonna have to stick to, that instead, we have individual souls. This is Emerson. And so Thoreau is picking that up when he talks about the different drummer. But he certainly, Thoreau's very controversial. There was a big piece in the New Yorker a year ago by Catherine Schultz trashing Thoreau. So that he can still get trashed. However, 100 and 200 years later is kind of amazing. 200, whatever. Many years later, but yes, Thoreau believed perforce that we each had to do what we were called to do. And what Thoreau was called to do basically was whatever Emerson told him. And that worked out pretty well, although Walden was not a success at the time. Many of these books were not successful when they were published. Thoreau famously said, I have 1,000 books in my house, all of them written by me. So, no, nobody paid much attention to Walden until the 20th century.
Hi. We tend to think of genius clusters, particularly in writing novelists, poets, what have you, somewhat withdrawn from the world. And maybe that's not a fair comment to do, but I was quite surprised the other day reading about Lincoln, and I noticed that when Henry Wadsworth Longfellow took a train tour campaign for Lincoln. First time I heard about that. I knew about Whitman and the poetry, although he never met Lincoln. So I was wondering how many of them did have a relationship with him, particularly when he did his tour in New England. Did he stop in Concord? Do you know any of them?
Lincoln was later. He's a little later. So what was the date of his tour of New England?
After the late 50s, early 1860s.
Right.
He gave a speech at Cooper Union, and it got a great deal of attention. He didn't expect that. He had his first portrait taken by Matthew Brady. He had his first suit custom made by a place called Brooks Brothers, which I think is still somewhere in Palm Beach. But in any event,
it's not in Manhattan.
The tour was sort of a clandestine tour. He told the world he was going with his son Robert to look at colleges.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the only place he looked at was Harvard. But he stopped at about 30 towns on the way. And then I was shocked to see that Longworth did a campaign tour for him in 1860. I didn't know that at all.
Well, they were all, the whole idea of a drunken writer alone in a garret has been disproved so many times that you have to ask yourself where it came from in the first place. Yeah. For one thing, all these writers, they didn't drink. So there goes the idea that in order to be a great writer, you have to be a great drunk. They drank a little, but they weren't drinkers. And they also weren't isolated. Hawthorne wrote Franklin Pierce's campaign biography, which is more surprising to me than Longfellow and Lincoln.
So I got a question. So was it this anger that
Where'd you go? Okay,
that she had throughout the entire book and having to write it that created You know, the excitement in the book, I mean,
Well, that's a really good question. I think often if you're doing something you really hate, something comes through. Not what you want, not what you expect. I mean, this is about the limitations of our consciousness. I mean, I say that, and I mean, this is Emerson, that my conscious mind is like a kid at the back of a train with a fake steering wheel, right? I think I'm going this way, but in fact, I'm at the back of a train with a fake steering wheel. And I think that often great writing comes out of anger, it comes out of fear. My father, for instance, wrote brilliantly about heterosexual love because he was a closeted gay man. And so he was able to project these fabulous romances because he wanted you to look over there.
I just have one other comment. I had a daughter at Smith and a daughter at Bennington. And I have to say, I had a much better time visiting my daughter at Bennington.
I'm sure you did. Bennington is a magical place. It's a walking genius cluster. Yes. Hi, Jackie. Mwah.
Always love hearing from you and listening to your brilliance come to jour. I wanted to ask you though, in this climate, do the classics matter anymore in education when people are not wanting to teach Shakespeare and substitute, I have no idea what? There must be a pushback against this cluster as well. So I know you teach and you must have answered some of these type of questions from your students. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there are two, I have two sets of thoughts that answer that question. You know, whether the classics will survive politically, I don't know. But one of the good things about Concord is it wasn't just men. And another good thing about Concord is that they were abolitionists. So they have some claim to not being a white patriarchy. Not a big claim, but there's that famous story where Thoreau refuses to pay his taxes because the government supports slavery. And he's thrown into jail in Concord, where the jail is, you know. And Emerson goes to visit him. And Emerson looks in at him and says, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" And Thoreau says, "What are you doing out there?" So they have a little political credit, not a lot, but a little. And the women, right? Which was when I first called the Harvard libraries and said, you know, has nobody written about this? Leslie Morris said to me, nobody's ever written about it and included the women. So thank God for that. But I don't know, you know, I try to get my students hooked on the classics. It's not that hard to do because the classics are, many of these books are very hard to put down once you pick them up. And so they kind of speak for themselves. But a book like Walden, which is not easy to read, which is also fueled by rage, I don't know. I have a whole thing that I didn't read you about what people mean when they say, oh, Walden, that's my favorite book. They don't mean they've read it. So it's a good question, and we're in the middle of a kind of revolution, both in teaching and in publishing and in writing, where voices who were never heard before are being heard, which is great. And some voices which were heard automatically are not being heard, which is, in my opinion, not so great. But, you know, I don't think it's shaken out yet. I think it's just chapter 2 here, so we'll see. Good question.
I was wondering what you thought of the recent Greta Gerwig movie adaptation.
Of Little Women?
Waited for it and was just dying to see it. I've seen it twice and wondered about what you thought.
Well, I had mixed feelings about it. The Greta Gerwig adaptation of Little Women. Did anybody else see it besides? Yeah. So, you know, the thing about Little Women is that family, and in the book, they're starving to death. They don't have fancy clothes. You know, they're not like running around the pasture going, whoop-de-doo, look at my hoop skirt. And so I felt that she missed that. And I felt that she missed a lot of the darker part. And then she made, who does she have play? The thing I really didn't like, that I really, if she had called me and said, Susan, how should I do this? The guy that Joe marries in the end is some incredible matinee idol, not an elderly German teacher. And, Louisa would have hated that. That's the whole point, is that she wasn't going to do that. So I felt that it was delicious. I loved watching it, but I thought it wasn't quite right. And of course, my experience of the world is that out of difficulty comes everything worthwhile. And so in a way, and that's one of the messages to me of the Concord group, and especially of the Alcott's. And that message just got lost. It just looked like they had a wonderful time. They had these fabulous clothes. Oh my God, the clothes. And they co-opted the woman who runs Orchard House. So they did their due diligence. And then in the end, Joe marries this hunky guy. So,
And but it was billed as being, because it was a female director of re-seeing this from a female point of view. That's
right. Well, I don't know. There are
explained
five.
that very
There are
interestingly.
5 movies of Little Women, and I think the best one is the Katharine Hepburn one. But yeah, I mean, I think Greta Gerwig is a genius. I just don't think she understood the book in the same way that I do. How's that?
Good.
Thanks.
I didn't like who she married at the end either.
That was a complete violation of the book.
It was kind of like ridiculous.
Yes, yes. So when you talk to Greta,
Anybody, with any more questions or comments for Susan?
Dale.
Okay.
Oh no.
I'm giving it to you. Last night when we talked.
Oh, this isn't fair.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And you told me, there's one book you really don't want to write another book. You said they suffered through every book. You swear you're not going to write another book. And everybody's asked you to write about your father and his short stories. Because that's who they think your father is, and they wanted to know what you felt about it. And so you named the book When All, what was it?
When All the Men Wore Hats.
So what are you doing? And are you angry enough that you're going to, and suffering enough when you're going to write it?
I don't know when I'm going to write it. I sort of started it. So the story, I'm sure I would. The story is so Dale's real question, because I have the mic. Oh no, you still have a mic. Dale's real question is, what am I working on now? And so, so I'm working on a book that I didn't want to write, and thought I wouldn't write about. I'm fascinated by. There's a whole new genre right now of books about books. Like if you read Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, it's really about T.H. White's book called The Goshawk. In other words, there's a lot more conversation between writers and their books than there used to be, much more like Concord was. And so people kept taking me out to lunch and asking me about my father's short stories. And it turned out I knew a lot. And so I thought, why don't I? So my father's short stories came out in an iconic red book in 1978. And I thought, why don't I write a book about that book? And it actually is pretty interesting because I was there when he wrote those stories. Many of them are about a little girl just like me. As you know, they're the basis of Mad Men. Mad Men is based on those stories, as Matt Weiner has often said. So I'm the Sally Draper of those stories. I remember what it was like to be used in that way and to have one's mother used in that way. But I'm also a writing teacher. So I'm looking back on those stories after 30 years of teaching writing and thinking, oh, yeah, so interesting. And then also, of course, I've got a lot of biographical material about my father, and I've got his complete journals and letters that also most people don't have. So it's interesting to look at one of those stories, and they are astonishing stories, and kind of put it all together in a way that makes a different kind of story. One of my models was Michael Bora, wrote a book called The Portrait of a Novel about Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. He wrote a book about a book about a book. And it's fascinating, the combination of biography, criticism, in my case, memory, what the things my father wrote about the story when he was writing it. Many of my father's stories also, like he wrote a story called The 548, and then Raymond Carver wrote a sequel to that story. So many of his stories have had a kind of continuing life, which is also pretty interesting, how some writing survives. So that's what I'm doing, or rather, let me put it another way. I signed a contract saying I was going to do that with an editor who I adore. And they give you money at the beginning. It's called a signing check. And then when you spend the money, you have to write the book. So I remember interviewing Joan Didion, and she said she decided not to write Blue Nights. And then she looked at her contract and went, whoops, got to write it. So that's the point where I am at.
Susan, we have one last question here from one of our virtual guests. I'm just going to relay it. What are your thoughts on Emerson being described as a racist, despite being an abolitionist, particularly because of words that he used?
The answer is I have no idea. I mean, and it brings up, this is a really interesting question because it brings up the whole question of context. In other words, when we talk about people in the 1800s, are we going to try to talk about them within the context that they lived? Or are we going to try to talk about them within our own context? And I think that us bringing our context to bear on them is a kind of colonialism. It's a kind of imperialism, because the assumption is we know better than they did. And so we can judge them for things that they weren't judged for at the time. But many people disagree with me. I mean, this is a big question that we could stay here all day arguing, but I think you have to take people in the context of their time. But most people don't. Well, here they do, because we're a genius cluster, right? But many people feel, and as I say, this feels like imperialism to me, that they get to say what people in the 1850s should do and say because they know better. Is that why they get to say that? I don't know. So I think one of the great dangers of our time right now is self-righteousness. And I think as soon as you find yourself thinking, this is wrong, you've got to ask yourself, because it's usually more complicated than that. But, it's a good question. I mean, I teach, so I've read many students talking about growing up in Africa and wondering why all their books had snow and blue-eyed children in them. And I get it. That wasn't so good. I mean, there's certainly things that happened. Well, I think I said, I mean, it's the question of context, and it's a huge question for every biographer. And I think it's a huge question for every reader, especially now. But I'm not.
I totally agree with you, and I think this whole series on Lincoln now brings that very much in the forefront, because, obviously it's being taken out of context.
Well, it doesn't bother me so much that they take things out of context. It bothers me that they think they're right. In other words, it's not so much that Lincoln did what he did. It's that I, Susan, know what he should have done. That's the part that makes me a little itchy.
Very well said. I feel
So,
the same way.
So my answer to the Emerson question is, I have no idea. I still love Emerson. I'm not going to stop loving Emerson, but you don't have to read him. That's okay. Zoom person. Last question.
Judy just has one more question here.
All right.
Excuse me, Susan, I always have one more question. But this is a group of people who read, or they wouldn't be here. Who are you reading now whom you're very excited about? Whom maybe, those of us here wouldn't know and should read?
Well, I loved Ahmad Akbar's book, which was pretty successful. It's called Homeland Elegies. I don't think I have any big surprises. I just read, oh, there's so many things, there's so many great books right now. Oh my goodness. And you know, there's so many, I mean, it's the golden age of reading. So if you guys read, you're in luck. There's so much good guidance now about reading. I just read something, I loved The Man in the Red Coat, that's last year. But I just read something I loved, which of course I can't remember. I loved the Michael Gora book about Henry James, that's 5 years ago. What else is there? Give me some titles and I'll tell you if I like. I mean, I read the way I read when I was 18 because my children grew up and moved out, which was tragic, but good for my reading. So I read in an addictive way. I will often say to myself, oh, I should do this and that this afternoon. I wonder what Nook recommends this afternoon. And I'll find myself at 3 a.m. reading something when I should have done all those other 10 things. But there's so many wonderful writers now. There's so many wonderful new writers. I mean, I just read the New Yorker on the way down. I mean, oh my God, in 1 week, that magazine puts together astonishing work, astonishing work. In fact, last night, I was talking about Proust with Ford and Brenda, and we were talking about music and writing and how somebody should put together a book because Proust, as you know, I love doing that, was often mentioning music and talking about music. And in Swan in Love, there's this phrase of music by a composer who Proust calls Vinteuil, but who is actually Ronaldo Hahn. And so Proust leans on music a lot. And the 3 of us were saying somebody should do a book that talks about Proust and music with the music included. They did. I mean, you know, I went back to Dale's house, read the last piece in the New Yorker, which is a review of that very book. So it's amazing to me how many smart, brilliant people, young and old, are both writing and thinking today. I think it's certainly the most exciting time that I've ever lived through. Yes, one last question.
I happen to be a journalist and a musician, but because social media is so prominent, one could perceive that many young the genius cluster, they're all on social media.
Well, but they're also writing books. They're also writing books. They've got more energy than.
Well, I think some are and some aren't from different things. They're caught up in social media and that's almost a whole culture in itself, that they're constantly reading, and like one can call it an addiction or doing one's responsibility to stay up with social media. And it's all getting like, it's like buying books or this, but it's the melange of how to get people to read and appreciate good literature, good music, culture in the mix of this frenetic social media.
So shall I fight with you or shall I agree with you? So I have.
I'm not here for a fight or agreement.
I like to fight.
Well, I can fight.
I have yet to see the book that social media kept from being written. I mean, we yak constantly about these young people and their addiction to the screen and their AirPods and blah, 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 blah. Right, but they do also seem to be writing wonderful books, which is so frustrating because they shouldn't be able to, but they are. And, you know, yeah, no, I guess I just
it's mixed from what I've been getting.
Well, I just, having battled to keep my children off the computer, I now feel like a dinosaur because they both live on the computer and they're Harvard lawyers, so.
Well, that's it. It's all different. Well, I have the same kind of family. So, yeah, but this is a very interesting.
It's a good, what the screen has done, but also I'm old enough to remember when television was the death of literature. And, surprise. And I'm old enough to remember when television was the death of literature and everybody was chain smoking. And when I think about that, when I think about my parents chain smoking, right? She was Mrs. Marlborough, he was Mr. Camel, opining on the death of literature because of television. I think, maybe I didn't know so
Well,
much.
there were some people that were getting, not even teaching their children to write, all they're doing is typing. So there's lots of little issues. And
There are a lot of
my-
issues.
My family, we have writers and all that. And that, so we've been working on that whole balance as well. And I guess I just wanted to bring it up as an issue that we're all sort of juggling.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Susan, so much.
Okay.